This is the video focusing on the life of the project for Module 6. In section 5.1 of your AIA text readings, we established the big picture of the life of the project. I want to take a minute to elaborate on this understanding to understand the logic of the flow of the tasks and work within a project. Most importantly for this chapter, the typical schedule shown in figure 5.1 on page 276 and seen here clearly illustrates how different kinds of information and tasks occur at typical locations in the overall project, such that the work of the overall project can be understood as a logical project process. This depiction of the process in the AIA text may, in some ways, however, needlessly confuse and weaken the basic logic and effectiveness of the project process. It does so by mischaracterizing the project phase as linear rather than an iterative information development process, as seen in the second diagram. This depiction is from the previous edition of the AIA text and is found on Canvas in the supplemental readings for this week. The previous depiction on page 276 on your AIA text also is misleading in representing costs as somehow outside of the process, rather than integral to making the iterative process work by being an ever-present governing factor. Importantly, the AIA text on page 280 correctly notes the overall theoretical process of the contract, which I'll reference in a moment. Then it correctly describes the necessity to go back and modify previous steps to revisit and update solutions in the paragraph that follows. However, the text then continues on in a way that confuses and weakens its depiction of the basic logic of the process by giving the impression that the clear progress of the project process and of the contract is somehow at odds with the non-orderly, repeated updates of reality, and that the situation is somehow problematic. The text implied conflict between a linear progress and the circular updating or the iterative process is not a problem in a project that is well managed. And if the project phase process is understood as an iterative information development loop, as we're seeing here, which advances both linearly in progress and circularly revisiting and updating together. I'll cite that reading from the AIA text on page 280 now to provide context to what I just described. The standard contractual definition of design services are based on a process that would theoretically permit the design team to move in an orderly way through the most common steps in the design, documentation, and construction of a building. This theoretical process assumes that a clear definition of the client's program exists and that the design process can progress in a linear fashion from that definition through a series of steps, each of which results in a more complete definition of the design, until the project has sufficiently detailed to go into documentation for bidding and construction. All of this statement is correct. Reality is not so orderly. Evolving aspects make it necessary to go back and modify previous steps, which is also correct. Design moves forward, but rarely in the straightforward fashion implemented by the standard two-phase description of design. In other words, building design neither starts with SD, schematic design, nor ends with the completion of the second phase, DD, or design development. And this is where the logic of the textbook starts to contradict itself and weaken what it's previously mentioned. In contrast to the assertions made in the AIA text, this marked up diagram here is a good illustration of the iterative feedback loops already built into the AIA B101 contract basic service phase structure for the traditional design, bid, build, delivery method. For example, contract section 3.2.5.2 for alternative building systems and 3.24.6 for cost, and many other such iterative provisions that are already included in the contract. Seeing and using the project phase sequence of a task as an iterative feedback loop allows the design, bid, build process to be managed quite effectively by design conscious, technically conscious, and process conscious firms, and in the experience. Further, these iterative feedback loops of greater or fewer numbers of longer or shorter durations are essential to all delivery methods as part of the basic continuity of the architect's information development process from concept to construction detail. Referring back to figure 5.1 in your text, if you were to ask most practitioners, I believe they would say that they have never imagined design as being a linear process in the first place, or wholly contained by the SD and DD tasks, or completely described in detail by the contract. The clarity and progress of the overall project process and contract remains effective despite the non-orderly reality that we face in the world, as long as we understand that the map, as shown in figure 5.1 here, is intentionally simplified so it can effectively depict the direction and goal of the work effort. The inevitable non-orderliness of reality is much easier to sort out and manage with the clarity of this simple map. Circling back to my statement that cost as an integral to the iterative process and not outside of the process. It's important for how the project process is depicted in figure 5.1 here to note how cost management, which are part of the tasks of the architect in the B101 contract for SD, DD, and CD phases, is located at the bottom of the screen and separated from the flow of the architect's work in the SD, DD, and CD phases. This misdepiction is remedied if, again, the project phases process is understood as an iterative information development loop, which brings cost management back in as an integral part of the development process. So even though cost estimates is listed down here at the bottom and appears to be separate from these different design phases higher up on this diagram, they typically occur at regular intervals throughout the project that are tied to these phases. And as these phases are revisited as the part of the iterative process, those cost estimates also must be revisited. I want to take a minute now to refer to the list of 12 major steps that is in section 5.1 of your textbook. In this initial chapter, it's listed as a model for a typical project. The text, however, does not clearly indicate that the sequence is being illustrated as based on the design, bid, build, delivery method, and that it will vary in important ways with other delivery methods that might be used on the project. Most notably, step 4, the selection of the project team, and step 10, selection of the construction team, reflect the design, bid, build, delivery, but do not reflect other delivery methods and have a large impact on cost management within these other methods, and thus on the SD, DD, and CD processes, as well as on the contracts that get used. This relates to my previous comment about how the baseline and overlay relationships we'll use in the upcoming modules. Lastly, I want to refer to this diagram, which is also part of the previous version of the textbook. In contrast to the emphasis placed in this particular chapter of the AIA text on the differences between delivery methods, this diagram here from the previous version of the text, which is also found under your supplemental readings for this week on Canvas, is also a good illustration of how the basic continuity of the architect's information development process from conceptual design to construction detail stays mostly the same despite the various particulars of each specific delivery method. Hence, the presentation of this information development process in Module 6 as a baseline perspective with delivery methods presented as in process overlays to the baseline perspective. We'll elaborate more on these different type of project delivery methods as process overlays in the upcoming weeks. So this week we're establishing a baseline process that's represented by the design, bid, build process as our baseline understanding for the flow and life of a project. Later on in the next couple of weeks, we'll start to explore different overlays through different project delivery methods that start to impact and change that life of a project but based on the understanding that this design, bid, build traditional project delivery method is a baseline for it.